Okay, so let's talk about the trickle-down effect in chapter 2.
Yeah, chapter 2 is an exciting chapter. We know that the trickle-down effect refers to any situation where, something, a concept, a philosophy, an ideology, or an action starts at the highest level of a position or a situation, and it trickles all the way down or throughout what that existence is. And so, for example, decisions that a leader make, a leader's thoughts, a leader's philosophy often has an influence on what happens to every other member of that team or within that organization. And that's what chapter 2 really talks about, right? What is the impact of the trickle-down effect on a team or an organization?
Yeah, so leaders actually do have power, and that power comes with certain responsibilities, and part of that responsibility is to understand that your behavior does have some impact, and situation all the way down to the client, or in the case of education, to the student.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so when you think about it from a negative context, what has been your experience as it relates to the trickle-down effect in education?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And so I want to share not only a negative context, but eventually we want to share with our listeners maybe at least one positive. And so in terms of a negative, what I have seen as a school leader, as a district leader, is because the philosophy of the leader, which is oftentimes espoused not only in their preaching or in their teaching, but it's aligned to the mission and vision of the organization, it often influences what happens with every adult action in the organization. So one negative is simply this. In one of my experiences at a school, I saw that I was an assistant principal at the time, and I saw where the leader whose belief was, you kick every student out of school, one, and two, that you focus only on what we call the MES subjects, the math, English, science, and social studies, and you neglect other subjects. We saw that every teacher in the building decided that, one, if a student acted up, they were going to perpetuate a zero tolerance because that's what a leader wanted. And so their suspension rates were through the roof. Similarly, we saw very, very small increases in math, English, science, and social studies, but all of what we call the specialist courses, right? Physical education and the arts, there was a de-emphasis on what happened with those courses, and that's because of the leader's influence.
Yeah, and so I guess more of what I was trying to get at was your work around the school to prison pipeline. And
Yep.
When leaders do have this zero tolerance policy, and sometimes this is pushed from the community is saying, hey, if we've got students who don't behave, we've got teachers who aren't making the mark, we've got more data than we ever could imagine. And
Yes.
clearly shows us that some educators are doing better than others, some schools better than others. And so when we have this zero tolerance policy, what does it mean for the rest of us who are not working every day in education?
And the data is alarming. The data certainly should sort of spike and influence a call for action. So the trickle-down effect as it relates to the school to prison pipeline, we know that that pipeline has its genesis in classrooms. So the trickle-down effect simply comes from this belief that if a leader believes that there should be zero tolerance in his school, or you should have a hierarchy of consequences where you're willing to suspend students or every single offense for minor offenses, then those referrals start in the classroom. So the trickle-down effect comes from the leader's philosophy, then it impacts and influences every adult action. And so what we have seen with the school to prison pipeline is not only alarming statistics that includes, one, 68% of all males who are currently incarcerated in state and federal prisons did not get a high school diploma. And so conversations with those individuals says that at some point in their lives, they were suspended a lot or kicked out of school. Not only is that statistical point alarming, but here's a more recent alarming data point that we often hear in the fields of education as well as in political arena. Economist Lance Lochner talked about the fact that if you do not graduate students, for every 1% increase that we have in high school graduation of males, it impacts not only education, but it impacts the economy. Here's how it impacts the economy. The crime rate in three major crime points increases when we do not graduate 1% of our males. And subsequently, or conversely, it decreases when we increase our graduation by 1% of our males in these three areas: aggravated assault, felony murder, and auto theft. And so for every time we increase the graduation rate for 1% of our males in this country, we can reduce crime rate in those areas. From an economic standpoint, what Lance Lochner has found is that uh, the suspension rates, which often comes from the trickle-down effect, can result in this country having to pay about $35 billion in different fees to support students who, because of the trickle-down effect, because of the school-to-prison pipeline, because of an increase in referrals to suspensions, and eventually they're going to drop out of school, we are not able to get any traction around reducing the economic and criminal impact.
Yeah, incarcerating people isn't free. So basically, what I heard you say is 2/3 of the people who are in our prisons today are individuals who were suspended in some capacity. And what you're asserting is that in those organizations whereby suspensions, or we have zero tolerance and suspension is running rapid, usually it starts at the top. We have that same approach with the leaders in our school, the administrators in our schools, and with our staff and educators. And then we, of course, have that same approach with our students. So many of the people who purchase The Power of 7 Second Chances are really interested in kind of the leadership perspective related to the trickle-down effect.
Yep.
And so I would love for you to share how, when you focused on being more empathetic and compassionate with the leaders, and you can pick any example that you choose,
sure,
how that then resulted in better outcomes for the students.
Absolutely. And those who are reading the book currently will find in chapter 2 that we actually provided them with a visual, with a diagram that shows that when you start with a philosophy around an empathetic and compassionate approach, ultimately it trickles down to every single adult in the building. And what happens is you increase your tolerance, and then it forces or encourages you to pivot towards becoming more creative and innovative in your strategies, your interventions, and your responses to students and student behavior. And so what we have found, when I have implemented this for other leaders across the country, when they have given me feedback about their approach around empathy and compassion, they have seen teachers and adults in the building really becoming more tolerant and exhausting every attempt at how they respond to students. Ultimately, what happens is they're able to keep more students in the building. And when you can keep students in the building, it increases their chances and their exposure to the instructional and academic program. And if you do that, ultimately, then you increase the likelihood that they are going to get some traction around becoming edified or enlightened in their content. And eventually what happens is you start to see schools achieving their bottom line, right? In K-12 institutions, we know that the bottom line is student academic achievement. And so in my experience, what I have found is, for example, I'll use Anacostia High School in Southeast Washington, D.C. Anacostia, a place that I am always proud to talk about, a place that has individual stakeholders who are really invested in what happens there, right? From city council reps to the mayor. And so here was what we found at Anacostia. Once we pushed and espoused and were committed to this idea of empathetic and compassionate leadership, we saw a school prior to my team and I getting there that had less than 50% attendance jumped at least 20 percentage point. And eventually, by the time we got to the 4-year mark, the average daily attendance had gone from under 50% to between 79 to 82%. What we saw were significant increases in student academic achievement. We saw graduation rates of the senior classes exceeded 90%. We saw a school that kept every single student who knocked on their doors in the building. But the trickle-down effect doesn't only have an impact when you have an empathetic and compassionate approach on students in a K-12 institution. Also has an influence on what happens to the adults in the building. As a result of my approach around empathy and compassion, we were able to retain 100% of our highly effective teachers 2 consecutive years. And so because you are empathetic and compassionate, your first response is not one where you are removing, evaluating, or pushing students or adults out.
Well, what's amazing is that for 2 years you had 100% retention in an area that would have been coined one of the nation's most notoriously dangerous schools. And so that's nothing to bat an eye at. That's impressive. And so what I learned from the work that you did there in our conversations was that, what does it look like in any industry if I can get people to stop thinking about performance management and evaluation, with the ultimate goal being termination if you're not delivering. But instead, if we looked at it and said, how can I approach this with a lens of how can I understand and be motivated to help people?
Sure.
Because I would venture to say that most people are looking at most students and going, we want students to be educated. We want the outcomes to be good. most industries, people look at their clients, they look at their patients, and they say the same thing. The problem is we don't always look at the leaders and the staff and the people who support our ultimate customer or our bottom line with that same lens. And so what do you have to say about that? Because I mean, I would imagine that if you go to Zappos, which we love the way that they run their organization, of course, the customer is incredibly important. We want their experience to be great. It would be incongruent for me if I was working at Zappos and I didn't feel as valued. And so, you know, what's your position on what does it look like from a staff perspective to really be thinking about, as a leader, how can I make sure that I don't skip over the people who report to me and only focus on the client, but everybody in my line of sight gets compassionate approaches.
And Nicole, so what is this approach is simply the antithesis for the hiring the best and firing the rest. I'll use Anna Koch again as another example, right? And what we have found was, as a leader, and my leadership team and I, my assistant principals and I, we got to this place whereby we decided that when we sit down to have a conversation with any teacher, any staff member, any other stakeholder, we were not just looking at them for who they were and the skill set that they have at this point in time during the time we're having a conversation. We wanted to become more reflective to see what does their potential look like. Is there a hidden ability? Is there something that we can use to develop them? And as a result, there were individuals who, during their first year or two, where their performance was mediocre at best. But there was at least one area where we saw that they had the potential to do well. And as a result, and this is timely because I just received a phone call about an hour ago from one of my former teachers who eventually, although she struggled as a teacher initially, became a dynamic teacher through coaching. What happened as a result of that? She was promoted to become an academic dean and then an assistant principal, and she just called to share just amazing news with me. She just received a principalship. 2 weeks prior to this, another member of the team, an assistant principal, he was assigned as a principal as well. All in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area. What is the result of looking at someone not for who they are and where they're performing currently, but thinking about how can they get better? That's part of what an empathetic and compassionate approach really is about. I am not going to judge you. I'm not going to evaluate you based on your shortcomings right now. And the last piece that I'll say around this is, you often hear me interject my personal story, right? I was rejected by 4 college coaches in 24 hours because they looked at my ability in the times that I was running in the now. But it took one person who was empathetic and compassionate and was visionary enough to see here is potential if we work with him. And that resulted in eventually landed me on the Olympic stage. And so from the adult standpoint, I think it's incredibly important that those individuals, after reading The Power of 7-Second Chances, will see what you and I are really pushing is this idea of building in time to look deeply into people's potential and their possibility and not what they're doing presently.
Yeah, and avoiding all most judgment and evaluation and replacing it with, looking through a lens of how can I be more empathetic and more compassionate towards these people. You made a statement to me once and I was like, man, that was good. You said the cavalry isn't coming.
It's not.
And so some of us don't have the ability. If you just think, the scientist in me says, it's not possible for us all to hire the best. It's just not possible if there's a such thing as the best. And so some of us are hiring, the people who are most interested in working in our industry or in our arena. And in some cases, what do we owe people in terms of gratitude for them having the heart to do the work? Yep. And if someone has the heart to do the work, the least we could do as leaders is to look toward coaching and developing and trying to discover strengths, using the words of Marcus Buckingham, versus leveraging or looking to highlight deficiencies.
Absolutely. So I think innately people want to do well, especially in the field of education. When you walk around a teacher orientation in the month of July every single year and you see 20, 30, 40, 50 brand new teachers who were just bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and filled with eagerness and enthusiasm, oftentimes what happens, the flame in those teachers and those staff members are often put out by leaders who were not tolerant enough to develop them. Yes, they're going to encounter students who make them want to quit in the first week, in the first month. But it takes a good leader. It takes an empathetic and compassionate leader to say to this teacher, look, I know you were struggling with classroom management. I know that you are not necessarily getting any traction around how you're delivering your lessons. So here's what we're going to do, and here's the plan we put in place. And we talk about that in the Power of 7 Second Chances, right? Make sure that you're putting a plan in place. Make sure you're looking at the survey that we provide to see how you can help those individuals.
Yeah, and the survey's available for free download on livelyparadox.com. One of the reflection questions in Chapter 2 is how can you or your organization address the notion that empathetic and compassionate leadership erode or diminish accountability? And I can say with a full force
yes,
that the organizations whereby we've said, okay, there's a moratorium on suspensions or terminations, the outcomes have improved, not gotten worse. So we're being explicit to say, listen, this is not going to be the tool by which we lead and manage. We're going to help you play the fundamental part of your role as a leader, and that's a coach and a developer and an advocate.
Yeah. You know, Nicole, as I think about the work that we have embarked upon with the Power of 7 Second Chances, I heard a powerful testimony just this past week from a highly visible political official here in St. Louis. And she was having a conflict with a colleague, if you may. And someone referenced the book, and she apparently read a chapter in the book, and she decided, you know what? Here's how I'm going to respond to this colleague. Instead of throwing them to the side, and instead of becoming combative and quarrelsome and cantankerous with them, she quoted, she said, I'm going to use a little bit of the Power of 7 Second Chances, and I'm going to engage with them in conversation. And that's the work that we're trying to do. We want to make sure that this work transcends the K-12 education arena. And so that those of us who are in positions of leadership and influence start to think differently about how we interact with and treat the adults, children, and every stakeholder in our path.
Yeah, and I just keep inviting everybody that if this is hard for you, when you think about your most difficult cases, then start small. At least start with the people who you believe deserve empathetic and compassionate leadership from you. And with that, I think that'll end our discussion around Chapter 2. Please let us know what you think about our approaches. You know, critique it as well. We are here to learn and grow, just as we want you to learn and grow.
Thank you. Look forward to talking to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.